as I said in the opening remarks, that if you want to see the thumbprint of God in the world, it seems to me the phenomenon of human language is where you look. I mean, human language is a psychic ability. I can make thoughts in your head by simply uttering certain small mouth noises. And the degree of fineness of the images that I can produce in your head and you in mine through the use of small mouth noises is something which we're still exploring. I think that, it's well known that the human animal has not appreciably evolved in 50 or 60,000 years, possibly much longer. Once culture was established, the soma of the human species was relatively stabilized. Then change was no longer genetic. It became epigenetic. And you get, just as the stability sets in the animal form, you begin to get this fantastic proliferation of epigenetic change in the form of the evolution of culture, languages, alphabets. It all seems to be related somehow to the encoding of information. And the psychedelic state also seems to be about the revelation of kinds of information which are normally either not efficacious or unavailable for other reasons. And it is not that culture is evolving. The evolution of culture is an epiphenomenon attendant upon the evolution of language. Language is the part of man which is evolving. Culture carries along. At the present moment, we are able to speak 21st century ideas to each other, but our culture is carrying along at about the 1950s level. Nevertheless, it seems to me that this thing which psilocybin does to the language-producing part of the brain is not then some mere affect, some trivial affect of an obscure hallucinogen on a peripheral part of the brain. It means that it is in fact a catalyst for evolution, because it is a catalyst for the evolution of language. We are not going to move into the future until we create that future through language. And the hardest thing to cause to change is language. It has an immense inertia because it is so unself-reflective of itself. And this is what we need to inject into it, is an element of self-reflection so that the evolution of language can become more conscious and less random. Because it's the non-randomizing of the evolution of language that will give us a real hold on the kinds of social modalities that we want to produce in the future. Now, I don't know if the tryptamine-induced glossolalia will have a major role to play in that. It may be simply one of the many promising scintillas or sparks thrown off by the psychedelic experience that invites exploration. But certainly all of these things, the chanting, the glossolalia, the inner discourses with alien forces, the self-examination of one's own motives, all of these things are linguistic activities and go on in the context of linguistic action. It seems to me that what these drugs synergize is cognitive activities of all sorts. This is why originally they were called consciousness-expanding drugs. And this synergy of cognitive activity has to be taken very, very seriously, because it's having a massive effect on our society. As individuals, we tend to concentrate on the 6 to 12 hours following the ingestion of a given drug. But the real impact is a societal impact that is spread out over decades. And I don't think that there's any question at all but what the best part of the social program of the LSD reformers of the 60s has been enacted in large measure It's simply that it's at a profane level, not pleasing to the purist. But I believe that people have deeper and subtler senses of humor. I think people have more refined aesthetic sensitivity. I think people have a greater sensitivity to the mysteries of human interaction, simply because so much LSD was taken in the 60s. And these are permanent changes that will not be wiped out. Our language is largely in the place where it was left by about 1969. But from the period of 1959 to 69, dozens of concepts and notions, ego trip, bummer, flashback, rupture of plane, all of these terms were invented that allowed a handle on the experience. And essentially, the whole 20th century cultural experience has been an effort to create languages sufficient power to give descriptions of the internal transcendence of being as we experienced it in the present at hand. And Stan touched on this afternoon. The Freudian interest in the repression of desire and the placement of the critical period in childhood. In other words, out of the present, but still within the context of the life of the experient. And then Jung trying to say, well, it's that, but it's more than that, and bringing in the notion of a collective unconscious. But it isn't that these guys were describing the unconscious or limiting or delineating the unconscious. It was that they were going through linguistic forms of metamorphosis in an attempt to describe what was a black box, which essentially I think still eludes them, because though the Jungian model was fairly satisfying, I think, by, we'll say, the middle 40s, it was just at that time that then these psychedelic agents began coming on, and what they show is that if we keep the Freudian term, the unconscious, then huge portions of the unconscious seem to have very little to do with human beings, individually or collectively, and that large portions of the unconscious present themselves more like a topological manifold, in other words, more like a place that is no more interested in the traumas or repressed wish fulfillment of human beings than boulders, wildflowers, and waterfalls are interested in these things. In other words, the unconscious began to take on the character of a dimension rather than a repository of energy. It seemed to be instead something deployed spatially that could be entered into. And immediately, of course, the literatures and traditions and mythologies of the world were searched, and we discovered, yes, shamanism. There is a tradition of a therapeutic practitioner who, in order to cure his patient or himself, goes to a place. And then there are many descriptions. It's either an ascent through cosmic levels or a descent into an inferno or into the center of the earth or into a cavern. But the stress was on the spatial metaphor, that it was a place. And I think that the psychedelics are beginning to confirm this in a way that's very hard for us to assimilate. In other words, it seems as though the science fiction metaphor of another dimension is actually in some ways more applicable than these reductionist models which wanted to say, well, it's a representation of a certain symptomatology, or it's a representation of a certain past event system. It doesn't seem to be like that. And it raises questions about the relationship of the mind to the body, which I talked about the first night, that are very interesting. One of the things, again, that Stan touched on this afternoon was what he called synchronistic events attendant upon taking psychedelic drugs. And this means that you take a psychedelic drug and then someone you've been thinking of who lives far away shows up at your doorstep. This kind of thing. Jung, the word synchronicity was coined by Jung, and it means a meaningful coincidence. But I think it was P.D. Bridgman who said that a coincidence is what you have left over when you apply a bad theory. And there can be just so many of these meaningful coincidences before somebody has to stand up and say, hell, this can't be coincidences, meaningful or otherwise. Something else is happening here. And on psilocybin, and I think it's based on anecdotal material, but I think it's generally true of other psychedelics in varying degrees, the synchronistic component is more like a poltergeist phenomenon. It's as though there are small eddies of autonomous psychic energy that disturb the periphery of awareness. It's the rats in the wall phenomenon. The scratchings, the rustlings, fire flarings need to be studied. The phenomenon of people lying on floors silent for hours and then sitting up at the very moment that the fire flares, the window blows open, the baby cries, almost as though there are waves of compression of coincidence, connectedness. What is it? I'm not sure.
Control.
Something like that move through a modality. So all of these things suggest that actually we don't know what we're doing with psychedelics. That because things that you put into your mouth that are not foods must necessarily be medicines, we have assigned these things to our doctors to explain to us. And I noticed in the first talk this afternoon, it was said, well, there's the schizotoxin, the theory that, the psychotomimetic theory. Then there's also the theory that these things induce religious experiences. But so did the psychiatrists who figured this out immediately step aside and make room for priests? Or what was the conclusion of that model of how it should be done? So I don't think they are, I think it's odd that our reaction to them was to immediately say, well, if you're dying of cancer, we'll give it to you. If you're seriously neurotic, you can be put on the waiting list. Everybody else hit the streets if you're interested. There is this notion, that what we all experience is mental health, and certainly doesn't require any drug intervention because it, in fact, is normality. But Jung and others have had, the idea of an open-ended process, that there is an unlimited potential for understanding and for coming to terms with being in the world and for opening up to other people. And I think that it would be very interesting to take the approach that these things should be restricted to people of proven exceptional ability. That going along with winning the Nobel Prize was your license to possess and take psychedelics and to hand them out to your friends. It's interesting that when this was all being hashed out at the very beginning, it was Aldous Huxley's notion that this is how it should be done. He said, engineers, artists, diplomats, administrators, people must be exposed to these things. And then somewhere along the line, I think personalities arose with messianic tendencies, and the notion became that you would count success in millions of followers rather than in the quality of the people who were taking it. And that proved, a sad thing, because the society in which that conception arose had a demographic bulge in the 12 to 30-year-old group, and it just all ended rather badly. So, as I said at the beginning, there's no conclusion about all of this stuff. It is the frontier. There is a very large frontier. We're very fond of the notion of an ever-expanding sphere of understanding. But has anyone stopped to notice that if you have an ever-expanding sphere of understanding, necessarily the surface volume of the frontier of the unknown becomes larger and larger? So, it's like building a bonfire bigger and bigger to convince yourself that there's an awful lot of darkness.